What if the greatest battle the Vikings ever fought had no swords, no blood, and no glory? No saga recorded it, no skald sang of it, yet it claimed more lives than any raid on English soil, and it returned, without fail, every single year. The enemy had no name. It arrived as darkness swallowed the horizon, as the fjords locked under ice 3 feet thick, as the sun rose for barely 4 hours and offered no warmth even then. In the depths of a Scandinavian winter, temperatures dropped to -20, -30 degrees Celsius. The snow did not fall. It buried, it erased, it silenced everything. Inside the longhouse, behind walls of timber and turf, a family sat in firelight counting. Not victories, not enemies. Food. This is the story history forgot. Not the fury of the berserker, not the terror of the longship, but the quiet, ruthless intelligence of people who understood one truth above all others. You cannot raid if you are dead. The real genius of the Vikings was never forged in iron. It was packed into barrels, hung from rafters, buried in frozen earth, and measured out spoonful by careful spoonful across 5 months of darkness. By the end of this video, you will understand why their pantry was more powerful than any weapon ever forged, and why the system they built to survive winter was the very engine that launched them across the known world. Survival did not begin with food. It began with where you put it. Before the first snowfall, before a single barrel was filled, the Viking household was already at war with time, moisture, and rot. And like any serious war, it required serious infrastructure. The longhouse was not simply a home. It was a precision instrument built around one purpose: keeping life alive through conditions that wanted to end it. Beneath the structure sat the Zval, an underground storage chamber dug directly into the earth. At that depth, ground temperature holds at 4 to 8 degrees Celsius year-round, regardless of what happens above. No refrigerator existed. The Vikings used the planet itself as cold storage, with nothing more than a shovel and the understanding that the earth remembers summer long after the sky has forgotten it. Above their heads, smoke from the central hearth rose slowly and pooled beneath the roofline. The longhouse had no chimney, not by oversight, but by design. That permanent haze continuously dried and chemically preserved everything hung within its reach. What looked like poor ventilation was a sophisticated preservation system operating every hour of every winter day. Outside stood the stabber, a storage barn elevated on tall wooden or stone posts. The raised foundation lifted grain above ground moisture and created a barrier against rodents. Narrow slits in the walls allowed cold, dry air to circulate freely, regulating humidity with a passive ventilation system that no modern engineer has meaningfully improved upon. The snows will be heavy this year. We must ensure the grain holds. 800 years before the refrigerator was invented, the Vikings had already solved the problem it was designed to solve, using physics, elevation, earth, and smoke as a single integrated system. But the building was only the container. What went inside was a system so sophisticated it fed entire fleets, and we are only beginning to understand it. Here is a truth no Viking saga will tell you. 90% of what a Norse warrior ate every single day was not meat, not fish, not mead, it was grain. Unglamorous, unpoetic, absolutely essential. The primary crop was barley big in Old Norse, chosen for one reason: it survived where nothing else would. Barley grows at 60 degrees north latitude, on thin rocky soils, in a growing season barely long enough to count. Archaeological excavations at Hedeby, the great Viking trading center in northern Germany, have uncovered vast quantities of carbonized barley in 9th and 10th century layers, confirming these were people who stockpiled grain with the seriousness of a military operation. Alongside barley grew rug rye, producing dense bread that stayed edible for days, and half-hour oats for the morning porridge that started every cold day with heat and slow-burning energy. The daily labor of turning grain into food was relentless. Women worked the Kvernstein heavy circular hand mills for 2 to 3 hours every single day. That sound, stone against stone, was the heartbeat of the longhouse. It meant the family would survive another day. The most common dish was grouter, thick porridge cooked in water or milk, enriched when fortune allowed with dried berries or a scrape of butter. Not delicious, not meant to be, engineered to be hot, filling, and sustaining fuel for bodies working in cold that would kill them if they stopped moving. But grain was never merely food. It was currency. It was power. A man whose stabber was full at the start of winter could feed his family, his workers, his warriors, and still have surplus to trade for iron or salt. That surplus created something priceless: time. Time not spent hunting desperately for the next meal. Time to think, to plan, to build. It was grain stored carefully, rationed without sentiment, that freed the hands that built the longships. Grain, not glory, launched the Viking Age. But calories alone could not keep a warrior strong through 5 months of darkness. The body needed protein, needed fat, needed something that could be stored without salt or smoke or fire, and the Vikings found it in the most unlikely of places. Consider this problem for a moment. Fresh milk spoils in a single day at room temperature. In summer, when the grass was thick and the cows produced more milk than a family could drink, that abundance became a crisis. Every sunrise brought more milk. Every sunset threatened to waste it. In a world where not a single calorie could be allowed to disappear without purpose, this demanded a solution. The Vikings solved it so completely that their answer is still eaten across Scandinavia today. They called it skyr, not yogurt, though many mistake it for one. It is closer to a soft, fresh cheese produced by fermenting whole milk with a starter culture, then straining away the liquid whey until what remained was dense, thick, and extraordinarily concentrated in protein. Skyr could be stored for weeks in the cool darkness of the Sval. It was eaten alone, mixed with dried berries, or thinned with water into a portable drink that warriors carried on journeys. The whey left behind was never discarded. It was drunk directly or poured over other foods as a preservative, its natural acidity creating an environment hostile to bacterial growth, extending the life of meat and vegetables without a single gram of salt. A zero-waste system of extraordinary elegance, born not from philosophy but from the absolute necessity of survival. And then there was butter. In the long months of summer abundance, every drop of surplus milk that could be churned into butter was churned into butter. Pure fat, pure energy. The warmth the body burns desperately in cold. A family that entered winter with full butter stores entered it with a fighting chance. But butter spoils. And this is where the Vikings made a discovery so counterintuitive, it reads almost like mythology. They buried it. Packed into wooden barrels or wrapped in bark, the butter was carried to the nearest peat bog and submerged beneath the surface. This was not desperation. This was precision. The bog environment is cold, oxygen-free, and highly acidic, three conditions that together create one of the most effective natural preservation systems on Earth. The butter could remain there not for weeks, but for years, for decades. The evidence is not theoretical. It is sitting in museums. More than 270 deposits of bog butter have been recovered from bogs across Ireland and Scandinavia. The oldest confirmed samples date back approximately 3,500 years. In 2013, a peat bog in County Kildare, Ireland, yielded a 2-pound lump of butter, estimated to be over 2,000 years old. Laboratory analysis confirmed it remained scientifically edible. The taste changed, pungent, waxy, deeply funky. But to a Viking family in the black heart of February, watching their food stores shrink by the day, that smell was not repulsive. It was the smell of foresight. Someone had loved them enough, in summer, to think of them in winter. To bury butter in a bog was not a preservation technique. It was an act of love, written in fat and cold water. But if butter was their silent treasure, what came next was their greatest industrial achievement, a product so durable it did not merely feed families through winter. It fed entire crews across open ocean for months at a time, without spoiling by a single gram. Picture the Lofoten Islands in January. The archipelago juts into the Norwegian Sea above the Arctic Circle. The temperature hovers just below freezing. The wind comes off the ocean without mercy. The light lasts only hours. It is not a place that invites industry. Yet every year from January through April, something happened in these waters that the Vikings recognized as one of the greatest gifts nature had ever offered them. Millions of Arctic cod scry migrated south from the Barents Sea to spawn in the warm currents around Lofoten. They arrived in numbers so vast the sea itself appeared to thicken. The Vikings did not waste a single one. The fish were gutted, tied in pairs by their tails, and hung on vast wooden drying frames called gel, open to the winter sky. No salt, no smoke, no fire. The work was done entirely by the climate. Near freezing temperatures prevented bacterial growth. The constant Arctic wind drew moisture steadily out of the flesh week after week. Over 3 to 4 months, each cod lost up to 80% of its original body weight, transforming from a soft, perishable animal into something that rang like wood when knocked against a table. The Norwegians called it turfisk. In dried form, stockfish could be stored for 3, 5, even 10 years without meaningful nutritional degradation. Lighter than grain, more calorie-dense than almost any other preserved food, and completely impervious to damp sea air. Before eating, it required effort, soaking for several days, then beating with wooden mallets to soften the fibers, but that was a small price for what it delivered. By the 12th and 13th centuries, the Lofoten stockfish industry had reshaped Northern European economics entirely. Norwegian dried cod dominated fish exports across the continent, flowing south to England, Germany, and the Mediterranean through the Hanseatic trading network. It was not merely food, it was currency. But long before it became international commerce, it was something more personal. It was what Leif Erikson packed into his hold in 1000 AD when he pointed his prow west toward a continent no European had ever seen. Compact, calorie-dense, unspoilable at sea. Stockfish did not merely feed that crew, it made the voyage possible. They did not preserve fish. They preserved time itself, condensing a summer's catch into years of future survival, pressing the abundance of the sea into a form that could outlast kingdoms. The protein board was their greatest industrial achievement, but when the sea froze and the cod could not be reached, the Vikings turned to the animals living beside them, and what they did with those animals in the weeks after the first hard frost was not butchery. It was mathematics. It was love. And it required a decision that no farmer makes lightly. Every autumn, sometime in late October or early November, the Viking farmer faced a calculation with no comfortable answer. He stood in his yard and looked at his animals, the cattle, the sheep, the gushenchu that had grown heavy through summer. Then he counted what was in his haystacks. The mathematics were unforgiving. There was never enough hay to carry the entire herd through 5 months of winter. The animals that could not be fed would die slowly, wasting the very meat he needed. So he made his choices. The oldest, the weakest, the ones winter would take regardless. He chose them before winter could choose for him. This was the autumn slaughter, not a celebration of abundance, but a precise act of resource management. Fresh meat was eaten immediately, shared with neighbors in communal meals that briefly made winter feel survivable. But the vast majority of every carcass was destined for something longer. Something that required patience measured not in hours, but in months. 2 techniques stood at the center of this work. The first was smoking. Cuts of meat were hung as high as possible beneath the longhouse roof, in the permanent haze that pooled under the thatch from the central hearth. The smoke performed its work on multiple levels simultaneously. It removed surface moisture, creating conditions inhospitable to bacteria. It deposited phenols and creosote compounds directly into the outer flesh, a continuous antimicrobial treatment, and it formed a physical barrier against insects that could destroy an unprotected food supply in days. The result was dark, dense, intensely aromatic, something that bore little resemblance to the raw animal it had once been, but that could hang under that roof all winter, yielding slices as needed. A variation of this technique survives in Norway today. Phenolor wind-dried leg of lamb traces its direct lineage to Viking preservation traditions over 1,000 years old. The method has not changed. It did not need to. The second technique was salting, and to understand what salting meant, you must first understand what salt actually cost. Salt was called white gold in the medieval Norse world, and the name was not poetic exaggeration. It had to be either imported from southern Europe across enormous distances or extracted from seawater through evaporation, a process so labor-intensive it consumed days of work to produce handfuls. Historical trade records from the 9th and 10th centuries indicate that in northern Scandinavian markets, salt commanded prices comparable to silver by weight. Every grain of salt that touched that meat had traveled hundreds of miles. To salt your food was to spend a small fortune, not on luxury, but on love. It was a declaration that the people in your house were worth the cost of keeping alive. When salt was available, it worked with brutal efficiency. Meat was packed tightly into wooden barrels, each layer pressed under as much salt as could be afforded. The salt drew moisture out through osmosis, collapsing water activity to a level where no bacterium could survive. A well-salted barrel kept in a cool cellar was effectively indefinite in its preservation. The combination of smoking, wind drying, and salting gave the Vikings something of profound strategic importance. redundancy. If one technique failed, another was already working. They layered their defenses the way a military commander layers his lines, because in the war against winter, a single point of failure could mean a family that did not see spring. But the most extraordinary preservation method required no salt, no smoke, and no heat whatsoever. It required only patience and a willingness to let nature do something that looked, to the untrained eye, like the very thing they were trying to prevent. Here is something that should stop you for a moment. 1,000 years ago, a Viking family sat down to eat food that smelled, by any modern standard, absolutely terrible. Food deliberately left to decompose in the ground, in sealed barrels, in conditions designed to encourage precisely the biological activity we spend enormous energy today trying to prevent. And it kept them alive, not in spite of what it was, because of it. What the Vikings had discovered entirely through observation, through the accumulated trial and error of generations, was the process modern food science calls lactofermentation. The mechanism was not scientifically described until Louis Pasteur articulated the role of microorganisms in fermentation in 1857. The Vikings were practicing its principles reliably, at scale, nearly 1,000 years earlier. Lactofermentation works because lactobacillus bacteria consume sugars in food and produce lactic acid as a byproduct. That lactic acid lowers the pH of the surrounding environment to a level where harmful pathogenic bacteria cannot survive. The food does not rot in the dangerous sense. It transforms. It becomes chemically protected by the very organisms working within it. The most extreme expression of this in the Norse world was Hakarl fermented Greenland shark. Greenland shark flesh is toxic when fresh. Its body contains such high concentrations of trimethylamine oxide and urea that eating it raw produces symptoms resembling severe alcohol poisoning. For most of human history, this made the Greenland shark effectively worthless as food. A massive animal, abundant in northern waters, completely inedible. The Vikings found the door in. The carcass was pressed into shallow gravel pits along the shoreline, weighted with stones, forcing toxic fluids out of the flesh over 6 to 8 weeks. It was then cut into strips and hung on drying racks in open air for an additional 3 to 5 months. What remained was chemically safe, nutritionally dense, and possessed of an ammonia-rich smell so powerful that first-time tasters frequently gag before the food reaches their lips. "Your nose will lie to you," a Norse elder might have said. Do not listen to it. In Iceland, Hakarl is still eaten today, a living artifact of Viking biochemistry, unchanged across more than a millennium. A less extreme but equally ingenious fermentation was rackfisk fermented trout, produced inland, where salt was even scarcer than on the coast. Fresh trout were rubbed with just enough salt to slow initial decay without stopping fermentation, then packed into sealed barrels for several months at low temperature. The result was paste-like in texture, bones softened to edibility, with a flavor so concentrated that a small quantity went a very long way. The same principle produced the Scandinavian ancestor of surstrumming fermented herring that remains, to this day, one of the most aggressively aromatic foods on Earth, salt enough to guide the process. Seal the container. Wait. Trust the biology. The barrels swelled as fermentation produced gas. To the Viking household that had packed them in autumn, that swelling was not a warning. It was a promise. To outsiders, the smell was the reek of something going wrong. To a family in the darkest weeks of winter, it was proof that something was going exactly right. Survival confirming itself, barrel by barrel, in the dark. What fermentation worked in sealed containers above ground, the earth itself was working silently below. And in the underground chambers, a different kind of preservation was taking place. Quieter, slower, and just as essential. Let me take you underground. Beneath the frozen surface of the Viking world, something extraordinary was happening. While smoke worked above and fermentation worked in sealed barrels, the earth itself held a different kind of treasure, quieter, more fragile, and in many ways more important than anything preserved by fire or salt. Because what lived in the underground chambers was not just food, it was color, it was flavor, it was the closest thing to summer that a family would touch for 5 months. The primary crops were root vegetables, swede, turnip, and wild varieties of carrot, chosen not for taste but for a single critical quality: the ability to remain nutritionally viable for months in cool, dark, undisturbed conditions. They were harvested as late as possible, pushed to the last moment before the ground froze hard, because every additional day in the soil meant additional sugar stored in the flesh. Preparation for storage was counterintuitive. The vegetables were cleaned of soil but deliberately not washed. The thin outer skin is a root vegetable's primary defense against moisture loss and microbial entry. Water weakens it. So they were brushed dry, handled carefully, and laid into storage with the seriousness of objects being placed in a vault. Inside the Z-vault, wooden boxes filled with dry sand or moss waited for them. Vegetables were laid in single layers, separated so no two touched, because one rotting turnip pressed against a healthy one could destroy an entire season's harvest through contact alone. In these conditions, a well-stored Swede could remain firm and nutritious until April or May, long past the point when the last smoked meat had been eaten and the last barrel of salted fish emptied. They became the foundation of skaas, the thick winter stew that defined Norse domestic life from November through April. Hours of slow cooking, a piece of smoked meat or salted fish added for protein, root vegetables breaking down into dense warming broth, not cuisine, sustenance at its most honest. Alongside the roots, barrels of fermented cabbage waited in the coolest corners, finely shredded, packed under weight until the leaves released their own liquid, undergoing the same lacto-fermentation as the fish and dairy. What emerged was the Scandinavian predecessor of sauerkraut, and it carried something that modern nutritionists would recognize as critically important: vitamin C. The disease that devastated European sailors for centuries, scurvy, killed thousands of men on long ocean voyages well into the 18th century. British naval records from the 1700s document entire crews incapacitated by it. Yet there is no significant evidence of scurvy in Norse populations during the Viking Age. The reason almost certainly lies in their cellars. Fermented cabbage and lingonberries preserved simply by submerging them in cold, clean water in sealed barrels, their high natural benzoic acid content doing the rest, provided continuous vitamin C through the winter months. The Vikings had no concept of vitamins or scurvy, but they had accumulated through generations the empirical knowledge that certain foods kept people healthy in ways others did not. They solved a problem that would kill European sailors for another 700 years, not through science, but through memory. Through every grandmother who had ever packed a barrel and watched her family make it to spring. Above ground, the forest gave generously. Hazelnuts stored in their shells for years, concentrated fat and protein that sustained a person through hours of hard labor in the cold. Dried lingonberries and cloudberries carried the taste and micronutrients of summer into the darkest months. But while the family ate, they also drank. And what filled their cups was not luxury, it was medicine. It was the one thing standing between them and water that could kill them as surely as starvation. The wells and rivers of a Viking settlement in winter shared space with livestock, organic runoff, and contamination that no one yet had the science to understand. Drinking unfermented water was a regular cause of illness and death. The Vikings solved this the same way they solved almost everything: fermentation. Their primary daily beverage was ole ale, consumed by every member of the household, every day, including children. Not because the Norse were uniquely fond of intoxication, but because ale was safe. Boiling the grain during brewing killed the waterborne bacteria that made raw water dangerous. What remained was a low-alcohol, cloudy, nutritionally dense beverage that modern food scientists would classify as liquid food. It was not the hop-bitter ale we know today. Hops were not yet in common use in Scandinavia during the Viking Age. Earliest clear evidence of hop cultivation in the region dates to the 11th and 12th centuries. Instead, Norse brewers used what the landscape provided: yarrow, bog myrtle, wormwood herbs that added bitterness and additional antimicrobial properties to the finished drink. The caloric contribution was not incidental. A liter of traditional Norse ale contained residual sugars, B vitamins from fermentation, and calories that meaningfully supplemented the grain-heavy winter diet. On a cold morning, after a bowl of oat porridge, a cup of warm ale completed a nutritional system. Ale was not a pleasure. It was medicine, nutrition, and hydration in one vessel. A fermented survival technology that predated the germ theory it unknowingly applied by nearly 900 years. And then, set entirely apart, there was mead. Brewed from fermented honey and water, mead was sweet, strong, and costly in the way that only things dependent on rare ingredients can be costly. Honey required bees, and bees required flowers, and flowers required summer, which meant mead was summer itself, transformed and concentrated, saved for the moments when summer felt most impossibly distant. A barrel of mead was not opened casually. It appeared at weddings, funerals, and the midwinter celebration of Yule when the darkness was at its absolute deepest and the community needed something that tasted like the opposite of winter. To drink mead was to briefly inhabit a different world, warmer, sweeter, closer to the gods than the frozen yard outside. A reminder, pressed into liquid form, that summer had existed once and would exist again. Yet despite all of this, the smoked meat and fermented fish, the stored grain and buried butter, the root vegetables and liquid bread, there were years when the mathematics simply did not work. Years when winter ran long and spring ran late. Years when the most careful planning collided with the indifferent arithmetic of nature. And in those years, the true depth of human endurance revealed itself. They called it nothing. There was no poetic Norse name for it, no saga language that dignified what it was. It was simply the end of the food. Late February, March, sometimes April. The smoked meat was gone. The salted barrels were empty. The last dried fish had been soaked and eaten. The root vegetables had shriveled. The ale was thin and running low. Outside, the snow was still deep, the fjord still frozen, and the first green shoot of spring, still weeks away, an abstraction, a rumor. Something that other seasons did, but this one seemed to have forgotten. This was the famine gap, the interval between the end of winter stores and the beginning of spring's first provisions. Not dramatic like a raid or a storm at sea, quiet, slow, a gradual narrowing of options until the options ran out. What happened next was not surrender. It was adaptation of the most radical kind. The first resort was the forest. People went to the trees, specifically to the inner bark, the cambium layer of pine and elm. This thin, pale layer between the rough outer bark and the wood beneath contains modest carbohydrates and trace nutrients. It is not food in any ordinary sense, but it can be eaten. It was stripped from trunks and sheets, dried slowly over the remains of the fire, then ground between stones into a coarse, resinous powder. This powder was mixed with whatever remained of the real flour, sometimes in proportions where bark accounted for 80 or 90% of the final mixture. The bread that resulted was dense, bitter, difficult to digest. It did not nourish well, but it occupied the stomach and quieted, for a few hours, the specific agony of hunger that makes rational thought impossible. Archaeological evidence from Norse settlements in Greenland, recovered from midwinter occupation layers at 20th century excavation sites, includes remains of bark processing consistent with emergency food preparation. These are not the traces of a culinary tradition. They are the fingerprints of desperation pressed into the archaeological record by people doing whatever it took to survive one more day. Dried roots, moss, lichens scraped from rocks and ground into powder consumed purely for the sensation of fullness. And at the furthest edge of extremity, there was leather, old boots, worn belts, boiled for hours in water, producing a thin, collagen-rich broth that delivered minimal protein but was warm and liquid and faintly sustaining. To eat bark was not defeat, it was defiance. It was a mother sitting by a dying fire, grinding tree into flour with her bare hands, refusing on behalf of the children sleeping behind her to let this be the winter that ended everything. Those weeks were the truest test of everything the Viking world believed about itself. Not the courage of battle, where death comes fast and is witnessed by people who remember it. The endurance of silence day after day, hunger deepening, cold, unchanging, and choosing, every single morning, to continue. And spring always came. The ice broke, the fish returned, the grass greened, and the people who had eaten bark and boiled leather looked at the warmth returning and understood something no comfortable life can teach: that survival is not something you achieve. It is something you choose every single day until you no longer have to. We began with a question. What was the greatest battle the Vikings ever fought? You know the answer now. Not Lindisfarne, not the siege of Paris, not any single morning of axes and shields that the sagas chose to remember. It was 5 months, repeated every year, against an enemy that could not be negotiated with, could not be intimidated, and did not care how fearless you were. And they won it generation after generation, for centuries, with smoke and salt, with buried butter and fermented fish, with bark ground into flour when everything else was gone. With the quiet, unromantic, absolutely relentless intelligence of people who refuse to be defeated by something as ordinary as winter. Look at what they built. Then look at what built it. The longships that reached Greenland in 985 AD under Eric the Red. The settlement at Lance O Meadows in Newfoundland, around 1000 AD, 5 centuries before Columbus. The trading networks, stretching from the rivers of Russia to the markets of Constantinople, none of it was possible without the stabber full of grain. None of it happened without the surplus that freed human hands from the daily emergency of feeding themselves and gave them time to imagine something larger. The Vikings did not conquer the known world because they were fearless. They conquered it because their barns were full and because the people who filled those barns understood that preparation is not the opposite of adventure, it is the foundation of it. Every barrel packed, every root vegetable laid carefully into dry sand, every strip of bark ground into flour in the darkest hour of the darkest winter. All of it was a vote cast for the future, a declaration that there would be a spring, and that they intended to be there for it. That is the real Viking legacy, not the raids, not the mythology, the pantry. What surprised you most? The bog butter that lasted 2,000 years, the stockfish that made ocean exploration possible, or the bark bread that kept families alive at the very edge of everything? Tell us in the comments. If this is the history you want more of, the hidden history, the story beneath the story, subscribe, because we are only getting started. Next time, we go further north and further back. The Athabascan people of interior Alaska, who built homes to survive minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, whose architecture of survival makes everything we discuss today look, by comparison, almost comfortable. The cold gets worse before it gets better. We will see you there.